Principle number 4 is that disc bulges and herniations will heal provided we remove and manage the movements and postures and aggravators that have created that damage. So to help kind of shed light on this, let's talk about one of the most common mechanics and injuries that we can create, which is what we call a posterior disc bulge, which eventually can become a posterior disc herniation. So if you imagine here my crude drawing here, there are two vertebrae, so these are the bones that are in your spine. Obviously between the bones, between the vertebrae, we have these little discs in here, which act kind of like, they give us the ability to actually bend our spine, they kind of hold the spine, help hold the spine together, but also kind of act like shock absorbers and buffers for damage. So when we'll talk about sort of, disc damage, it's actually pretty hard to create disc damage in like one go. It's more like you would have created a lot of the damage very slowly over a long period of time with slightly goofy movement mechanics or bad habits and postures, and then eventually it would have been something that kind of tipped it over the edge. So how do we create this sort of injury? So if we got imagine here we've got a nice healthy disc here. So we have the kind of the outside area, which is very tough, fibrous connective tissue called the annulus fibrous. Inside, we actually have a gel-filled nucleus inside, which again helps mitigate force going through it, a bit like a shock absorber would. So what happens over time is that how we create a bulge or a herniation is that the fluid inside the nucleus is going to work its way through the layers out to the edge to create a bulge, and eventually it'll kind of burst through and create a herniation. So how is that damage created? Well, if we took that disc out, for example, and we were going to look at it from a kind of a top-down view, it almost has a kind of similar structure to sort of layers of an onion. So if we were to take it out, this is our disc here. The annulus fibrous, the tough material outside, actually has layers in it. Again, similar to what you get in an onion, like this. What makes that disc tough and durable, but also gives it movement. So in the middle of here, we've got our gel-filled nucleus here. So what happens is that, say we're flexion intolerant, what we call flexion is basically rounding that lower back. So say we're going to take that disc out, we're going to use this balloon as a bit of a crude model here. When we flex, what actually happens, if this is the rear of our spine, this is the front. So we're rounding out, we're opening up the rear to sort of round forward, and we're actually compressing the front of the disc. So if we look at the balloon, imagine this is one vertebrae, this is another vertebrae, and the balloon is the disc. Imagine if we flex, we sort of compress the front end, and if you can see it pushes, it creates force to push out towards the back. So if it's within limits, it's not going to do any damage, but if that happens too much, too often, that's actually going to start to push the nucleus out, and it's actually going to start to snake its way through the layers. So imagine if this is the front here, this is the rear of a disc, so we're compressing here, we're compressing force here with our flexion, we're forcing out the nucleus this way. So what that looks like from top down is we're going to create compressive force on the front, and we're going to start to force fluid. It's going to snake its way through the layers, and then it's going to come out, and eventually it's going to create what we call a bulge here. So that bulge is when it hits the last area, the last layer of the fibrous material, but it hasn't quite reached through. So at this point, you could have a bulge, if you're unlucky, that's just sort of starting to touch the nerves in your back, which is going to give you things like sciatic pain or numbness or other things that might go on. If those compressive forces are still going on unchecked, so those aggravators are still running wild, what's going to happen eventually is that bulge is going to burst, and it's going to become a herniation. So when we have a herniation, we actually start to leak fluid out, and we start to lose a bit of disc height. So if you've got an MRI scan, you might see that the disc that's got a herniation that's damaged actually looks slightly darker in colour than the other discs that are healthy. That's because you started to lose fluid, so therefore it's going to look dark on the MRI scan. So obviously over time, what we need to do is we need to identify for you what are the specific movements and aggravators that are creating that damage. We need to manage and remove them to stop any more damage being created. But also, if we do remove them and we give the back enough time to settle, it'll actually start to gristle and harden any bulges or herniations we've got, and then start to nibble away at them and start to heal them. What it can't do is if we've lost disc height, we can't reinflate the disc, but we can definitely heal the bulge and the herniation and stop any more damage from occurring, and basically let that disc basically go on early retirement. Because the reason why it's worn out is that the current movements and patterns that we've got creates too much wear and tear on that one or two discs, and they do too much work, so they wear out too quickly. They start to leak fluid, and that's when they start to break down. So we know that a long-term strategy is going to be identifying any movements that are creating this problem, this damage, removing them, let the back settle, and now let's replace those movements with movement strategies and postures that spare these discs from doing too much work ever again, so that we can preserve what we've got and keep a nice, healthy, unaggravated spine. But once we understand this, we know the importance, we really understand the importance of identifying for you what your specific triggers and aggravators are that we need to remove to stop any further damage from occurring.